Welcome back, class. So for this session, we're going to be talking about three movements that are in three different chapters, 1925A, 1923, and 1927C. And they all have something in common, which is that they're all indebted to and influenced by and more or less enamored with technology and the machine. In three different places, though. Purism is largely France, Bauhaus is largely Germany, though it becomes international, and Precisionism is from the United States. So for this session, I thought we would just do it all in one fell swoop, just one video, go through them maybe a little bit more quickly, so that we can see their commonalities and see the common thread that's running through all this, which is basically a machine aesthetic. So the aesthetics of machinery influencing these movements, these post-World War I movements. So we're going to go in this order: Purism, Bauhaus, Precisionism, which isn't exactly the chronological order from the chapters, but that's okay. It's just the way I thought it would set up more seamlessly this way. So we're going to start in 1925, where there was a very famous exhibition called l'Exposition Internationale des Arts Décoratifs. It's in Paris. And Art Décoratif, decorative arts, that got shrunk and became Art Deco, which maybe you know. Art Deco is a style. We see it in our city, right here. I thought I would just show you this. This is out of sequence now, but the Chrysler Building is a typical Art Deco style from the 1920s. So it's slightly still an organic kind of shape, but it's definitely infused with like a streamlined machine aesthetic. And so at this exhibition, which has become a pretty canonical exhibition, they showed the latest, let's say, interior design, furniture, decor, and architecture. And this is what these spaces would look like. This is from Charles Moreau, Art Deco furniture from the exhibition Art Décoratif, the Art Deco in Paris from 1925. And you see a space that's a private setting. It looks, you have a bed and then you have a sofa. So it's this domestic interior. And it's more or less luxurious. Though, as your book points out, like there were already knockoff versions of these things in department stores. So it wasn't, let's say, cutting edge. It wasn't really like the forefront of design. And for the most part, it's been deemed to be at the level of the works themselves, somewhat inferior, and somewhat, let's say, just kind of popular, more at the level of kitsch. Whether or not that's fair, that's for you to decide. But there was one. So here's just out of order. But there was one architect who was part of this exhibition who criticized it for all these same reasons. Reasons that it wasn't very forward-looking in its style. He also didn't appreciate the fact that most of the work looked luxurious, and then, in fact, in the exhibition, they were luxurious, they were expensive, and they were made for like a space, right? They had to be custom-made, tailor-made for a space. And this was the opposite of the conception of interior design and architecture that this artist and architect had. Maybe one of the most important French architects of the early 20th century is Le Corbusier. So sometimes he's just called Corbu for short. But he criticized his Art Deco colleagues at this fair. And along with the fact that he said it was just kind of too luxurious and it was retrograde, it wasn't really forward-looking, he didn't appreciate the fact that it was kind of lionizing very bourgeois ideals of the private home, where everything, again, had to be custom-made. So Corbusier was much more radical in his decor, much more radical in his conception of design and of architecture. And above all, as you can see in his pavilion from the Art Deco exhibition of 1925, it's far more streamlined. It was called Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau, the pavilion of the new spirit. It's much more streamlined, much less decorative, much more angular. You don't have, if Art Deco still like, you've got kind of like vegetal, organic, biomorphic shapes in some ways, even though they're fused with like, technology. With Corbusier, you get the sense that all these things are just 100% based on technological know-how. They're streamlined machine kind of look, and they look like they've been factory made. So this is a key thing for Corbusier. He has a conception of decor and of architecture that's modular, where things can fit in multiple ways, and also within the logic of the assembly line, where these things can be mass produced and used as living spaces. So this might seem strange to us because I've actually never, believe it or not, I've never been to an IKEA. But I imagine what IKEA is like, it looks a little bit like this now, right? Where you have all these things, they're all the same, it's all mass-produced. I mean, there are variants and stuff, but it's a very mass-produced, machinic sort of operation based on assembly lines, not in the United States, but in countries around the world, probably quote-unquote developing countries. So our mindset here is a little different, right? I think we've become a bit skeptical about assembly line and mass-produced objects. But in 1925, this is still in some ways a novel thing that's getting underway. And you can have an artist like Corbusier who thinks that this is the future, still the future, right? We're trying to get away from it because it's just creating trash, detritus, pollution, exploited labor conditions, all these things, right? I mean, this is we're now trying to consider it part of the past. But for Corbusier, it seems to be like the wave of the future for him, as a style, as a mode of interior design and of architecture. And so here, just an example of Corbusier. This is from 1925, so you're only getting an interior. And in this class, we focus a lot more on painting and visual arts, and not as much on architecture. But I do try to squeeze in every once in a while some architecture, because architecture is fascinating. The history of architecture is fascinating. So this is an example of Corbusier's architecture, the Radiant City. This is in like a suburb of in France. So you can tell this is like a modular unit. It almost seems like you could take one of the apartments and just switch it with another, and you wouldn't notice, right? It's a large scale, and there's a certain amount of efficiency. But he did have plans that this would somehow, like, he wanted to get away from the old conception of like the Haussmannization, where you have all these buildings cramped together. His vision would be like cities that are in towers, and then this leaves space open for greenage and for parks and for nature and so on and so forth, right? So there is a utopian aspect to this, but I think your eyes can tell you that this is the history of these kind of buildings. Actually, is the history of public housing. So in France, it's well known, like they're called HLMs. And Corbusier actually built one. They come out of this kind of design, which at first is kind of this utopian space where everything is efficiently organized. But then, of course, with a little bit of age, a little bit of wear and tear, and then financial and economic and social neglect, these spaces can become kind of miserable, or maybe not kind of miserable. They become miserable spaces, and a lot of these recently have been torn down. So it's an interesting history of architecture. But above all, what we need to know for this class is Corbusier is obsessed with and interested in the idea of the assembly line, the machine, and standardization. And this has a history. You don't think about this, but like, the whole history of the 20th century and 19th century, already beginning in the 19th century, is a history of an economic model that is now called Fordism. So the idea that products are no longer made by like individual people who oversee the whole thing, but basically you have an assembly line logic where one person is doing one thing, another person is doing another, and another person is doing another, right? This is terrible for the worker, because the worker is just like doing the same thing over and over and over again. Marx would have called this a form of alienated labor. But for those who own the factory and those who are making profits off of what's being made there, who own the capital, it's great, because there's nothing like this kind of standardization and regimentation and division of labor to create speed and efficiency and profits, right? So we see this in the very unfortunate history of factory farms, where through this assembly line process, more and more animals can be killed, more and more animals can be processed, and more workers are kind of standing side by side and doing the same thing over and over again, which, if you've been reading the news, is a big issue, because it becomes a hotbed for COVID-19, for the coronavirus, which itself comes from a zoonotic source, an animal source. With so many pandemics have come, if not all of them, have come from these conditions. And I don't bring this up willy-nilly, and because it's kind of my wheelhouse. This is the topic I work on a lot as an animal studies scholar. But Ford and Taylorism gets the idea of the assembly line from the disassembly lines of the Chicago and Cincinnati slaughterhouses in the 19th century. So there's a historical connection there. So the history of automobiles and of factories and of large-scale animal processing in factory farms and slaughterhouses, they're actually conjoined, and they all fall under this rubric. They all fall under this paradigm of Taylorism. So Taylor, he's the first one. He writes a book called Principles of Scientific Management, and he's the first one to start theorizing, like, how do we make the assembly process more streamlined? How do we make everything standardized so that we go from, there was a point in time where you'd buy an article of clothing and maybe it was its own, like the way it was made was erratic, like it could have maybe even be made for you, right? There was no other thing like it. But fast forward 100 years or whatever, and then you go to H&M and you buy a shirt that is exactly the same, more or less, as like probably millions of those shirts, and they last for like 5 months or something like that, right? So this is also within the history of planned obsolescence and very, very cheap popular goods, right? So again, for us, this feels like something we would criticize, especially if you're coming from social theory that's more informed by working class politics. But for Corbusier, it would be a very welcome thing. So I'm saying that the assembly line and Taylorism and Fordism, this idea that standardized production was somehow universally loved, that's not quite true. So you do have dissenters at the very beginning who see certain problems with this turn, this social turn and this economic turn. And one of the wonderful examples of this is Charlie Chaplin in his movie Modern Times. So if you've never seen Modern Times, if you've never seen a Chaplin film, this is one of his best. It's very, very good. City Lights is also incredible, maybe even better. So is the Great Dictator, and I'm actually going to show you a clip of that in our last session this semester. But for now, here's a short clip of Modern Times, which will give you an indication of what this Taylorism, Fordism was all about, from a comedic, social critique standpoint of Chaplin. Chaplin.
To work. Go on. Section 5, keep it a limit.
So it's a really wonderful scene. So much to say about it, but basically, it shows you the Taylorist principles. It shows you the Fordist assembly line. It shows you the standardization of the products, and in a comedic way, it shows you all the ways in which, for the human labor involved, it's problematic. And Chaplin even basically blows a gasket at the end and is swallowed up by the machine, which is a fitting allegory for what we're talking about today, which is the influence of the machine aesthetic on design and architecture, but also on painting itself, right? So here's where we shift the focus a little bit towards painting, and we go a little bit further back in time now, from 1925 to right at the end of the war, 1918. And there's a book that's published by Aux Enfants and Jeanneret called Après le Cubisme, which is just translated to After Cubism. Aux Enfants was a painter, an artist, and Jeanneret was also a painter and an artist, but he was also going to become Le Corbusier when he changes his name, and this very famous designer architect. And so they write this book. And they apply these Taylorist principles that they're influenced by to painting. And so you end up getting works like this. So this is Corbusier's, but not his design or architecture, but his purist still life. So the movement here that we're talking about with Aux Enfants and Jeanneret, or Le Corbusier, one and the same, is Purism. And Purism, in some ways, it's a complex definition, but you're basically like distilling and reducing elements down to their basic forms, but purifying also in the sense of like making things streamlined, making things very clear. You see how this fits with the logic of standardization and of the assembly line and of Taylorization that I've set up for you. So you quite literally have a painting that looks like it's standardized shapes that come off a factory line or have been bought in a store. So pipes, a bottle, maybe... I'm not sure exactly what you'd call this, but like a type of molding or something, architectural or decor molding, right? So he's using these shapes to create a composition, but the composition itself is made up of components that seem to be like standardized industrial machinic shapes, right? So the way this is described normally, the advent of Purism and this manifesto of Aux Enfants and Jeanneret is inaugurating the idea of returning to order. There's a French term, rappel à l'ordre, which means return to order. And this is not only a return to order in the sense of like assembly lines are orderly and they have, they're like, they're efficient and so on and so forth, and you're seeing it in the painting itself, but also return to order after all the wild experimentation that had played out in the avant-gardes that we've studied so far in this class, especially Cubism. And so this had a historical dimension, right? Because think about it. After the war, France and Germany, everything is devastated. France, in some ways, is kind of humiliated in the war. and of course so is Germany, because ultimately they're the losers of World War I, and their horrible restrictions and treaties that really impose a lot of duress and difficulty on the country, which we'll talk about next class. And so there was an idea that, like, it's almost karmic in some ways. It was thought that, like, all this wild experimentation that happened before the war, Cubism, Fauvism, all this stuff, was somehow a weakening of the national spirit, and that what we have to do now is get back to more serious and more ordered and less like experimental and wild forms of art. So we have to go back to more tried and true and more stable forms. And so even Picasso got in on this, where he starts to go back after analytic cubism, synthetic cubism. He starts to make paintings that almost look like they're classical, or at least like Renaissance, right? Renaissance forms of portraiture. So this would definitely be symptomatic of this return to order, wanting to go back to something more stable, more tried and true, and less experimental. Purism is was also understood in that sense, right? So it can be understood as a taming of cubism. So here you have an example of analytic cubism. If you put it next to Jean Honoré or Corbusier's painting here, you definitely get a sense that he's taken the maelstrom and the chaotic elements of analytic cubism and streamlined them, and then made them orderly and clear in his paintings. Because there are ways in which this is influenced by Cubist collage. It's painting, but it looks like these elements have been collaged, but it's also clear and streamlined in a way that analytic cubism certainly was not, right? So the return to order is often talked about like as a taming of cubism, but then also a taming of Fauvism. Fauvism itself was inherently wild at the level of color and experimental. Notice how comparatively drab and muted the colors are in Purism, in Jean Honoré's example. So again, think of this as a psychosomatic, like a symptomatic turn, especially in French culture, though it happens throughout Europe in the late teens and 20s, aside from the more like transgressive avant-garde movements that we study. There was this impulse to try to go back to something more simple, more orderly, after just the chaos and misery and destruction of World War I, right? So we're placing this movement within a historical context in a very secure way. But so Ozenfant and Jean Honoré, Corbusier, they write basically the manifesto, the text for Purism, but they're not the most famous or celebrated Purist painter. That would go to Léger, who you actually saw already in this class, though I didn't mention it. On the wall in Corbusier's Pavillon de l'Esprit Nouveau from 1925, there was the baluster, which is a pretty well-known painting by Léger. And I think right off the bat, you can tell that this is also a Purist work. The shapes have been reduced, have been purified, distilled, refined, standardized in many ways, and they look machinic. On top of that, you have classical elements here, right? This classical column that seems to be in the center. It seems to be collaged, although this is all painting, collaged just in front of this very basic industrial shape, this red shape with like a hole, which is often equated to, like those steamships, or like, I don't know, think of like the Titanic, these old ships that would have these big these big exhaust steam shapes on the top of the ship. It's often equated with that. So he's introducing these basic shapes, basic elements that seem to be referring to the latest forms of technology, including perhaps film. And I don't have time because we're covering quite a bit today, but Léger also is one of the first to work with experimental film. He has well-known instances of working with film as experimental. And here's another example of his purist work. This is probably one of his most famous, along with The City, which I don't show you. But this is three women. And once again, you're seeing this is just like prototypical purist style. The women themselves, the three women, look like they're standardized, factory assembled units, right? So that, like, almost think of Mr. Potato Head or something like that. Like the hair, you could swap out her hair, put it on this one, and then put that hair on her, and it would work, right? As if even the connective parts and the connective tissue of these bodies are simply, tabs that you can just insert and swap out. And it's the same thing with almost all their body parts, including their breasts and their kneecaps and their legs. And then, of course, also the decor and the furniture itself, right? Everything feels like it's a standardized tubing, machinic sort of composition. It's indebted to Cubism. I think that's quite clear. But it's a form of Cubism that's almost, rather than the shapes coming from the mind of the artist, the shapes are coming from a factory somewhere, right? So that's the essence of Purism. What's interesting is that at the Art Deco exhibition, there was also a Soviet pavilion, and the Soviet pavilion was diametrically opposed to everything that was going on there. Right, the rest of the Art Deco was a glorification of Western Europe, and inherently then a glorification of a capitalist system of private accumulation, domestic spaces, and luxury. Right. So Konstantin Melnikov comes along and makes the Soviet pavilion, which is completely different from everything else, although Le Corbusier is kind of in the middle, where his is just this dynamic structure, very, very machinic, far more even than Le Corbusier, and definitely not a lap of luxury. It's much more of this constructivist architecture that's super dynamic, super functional, very transparent, not trying to hide anything. And rather than being focused on private taste and consumption, the Soviet pavilion, as you might guess, was more geared towards collectivity and towards the working class, right? Here's this is the model. So we don't have a black and white photo. We don't have a color photo of it, so we only have this black and white photo. But it would have been these very classic Russian constructivist colors of red, black, and white. And inside this, there was a very famous room built by Rodchenko, our old friend from the October Revolution. He created the Workers' Club in here, and it was a direct critique of capitalist luxury and the veneration of the private sphere and private spaces and domesticity, and it was relentlessly collective and also interactive. So think of this as a break room for workers, where they can go read the news, become informed, become more knowledgeable, and a lot of this would be usable. Like there's a screen that comes out where you can watch film. The table itself was movable. So this is a constructivist notion of interior design, where it's not this static thing that's luxurious and you're there passively as a consumer. Here you're much more within a utilitarian space, an active one where you're a worker, actually using your hands and your mind in tandem. At least that's the idea built into this interior decor. So it's the complete opposite of the luxury and private tastes of the Art Deco exhibition. And so now we move on to our second movements. We go to Bauhaus, which starts in Dessau in Germany in 1919, and it will run through 1933, and that's a key date. That's almost like the end date of our class, because this is the rise of National Socialism, the Nazi Party, and Hitler in Germany. And so there'll be severe repression, and Bauhaus artists, the Bauhaus school will be forced to be shut down. And then you have basically like a diaspora of Bauhaus teachers and artists throughout the world. A lot of them end up in the United States and other places. So the Bauhaus idea, the Bauhaus style still lives on. after 33, but not in Germany. And so the first thing to know is that Bauhaus was a school, and it was a place where you had teachers living almost in like this communal setting with the students. It was very egalitarian. Some of the teachers are, people like Paul Klee and Kandinsky, at least initially in the first iteration of Bauhaus. And it was a very egalitarian, sort of forward-looking school where you would work on design. You would work directly with teachers, you would collaborate with students, you would work on design, you would work on architecture, and you would work on like the very basic building blocks of art, beginning with line, color, form, construction, and all sorts of things, right? So here are this is Marcel Breuer. He's pretty well known, a pretty famous Bauhaus architect with these three students. And there were a lot of women in this movement. So in many ways, like Bauhaus was egalitarian, not only at the level of like teacher and student, but also egalitarian when it comes to the sexes in certain ways. And so in Bauhaus, not so much at the beginning, where it was more involved in inspecting older forms of craft and art theory, especially like color theory. Towards the mid-20s, with new blood, new teachers, especially Mihaly Nagy, who you're going to meet in a second, Bauhaus starts to move towards more machinic forms of an aesthetic and even machinic forms of production. So this is Jus Schmidt, a poster for a Bauhaus exhibition from 1923, and I think you're seeing the influence of Russian constructivism here in the font, in the overall composition of this poster, and in the fact that this looks like both an architectural blueprint of like this building, which, like Purism, seems to be modular, like certain shapes could be moved around and played with. The Bauhaus architects, like they loved playing with very basic materials and architectural units that were modular, so that you can like make lots of different things with them. There's a wonderful recent documentary on Bauhaus, because there's still a Bauhaus school in Germany today. I mean, it's been renewed, and teachers working within this Bauhaus style. And today they're sort of working on more minimalist architecture that can be movable and interchangeable and much more efficient. So it's an interesting thing to check out. Check out that documentary. I might put a link on the website. But it looks like an architectural layout, but it also looks like a person, right? This is a head with a mouth, a nose, and an eye, right? So it's this fusing of architecture, technology, and the human body, which is very fitting for our class today if we're talking about this machine aesthetic. They would put on plays. There's a rich tradition of dance and theater in Bauhaus, and they would make these wonderful costumes that are part carnival, part sort of like space alien, like sci-fi technology kind of thing. To your eyes, maybe it won't look like that. Like this looks very, very old. But if you watch something like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, which is being filmed like right at this very moment in the mid-20s, you would see an early instance of sci-fi, and it would almost look like this woman here and the way she's dressed would look right at home in that science fiction world of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. So this is carnivalesque, but also a form of technological, like tech-savvy costumes. Mihaly Nagy was one of the key teachers who came in to Bauhaus and really reoriented the school towards this more machine aesthetic. And one of the things he's well known for, we're going to talk about him more when we get to photography, but he was so into technology and the machine that he thought like the future of art, the future of work would be made through light. That light itself would be the medium that we be using. Electricity, these technological technological advances, and he used it in his photography. So this is a well-known photographed by him in Berlin. It's certainly fetishizing technology. You're on this sort of radio tower, and you're pretty far up, so you're seeing the view in a way that you would not really be able to see with a human eye. And so for him, photography is this machinic extension of the human being. So it fits with this, right? Photography itself for Moholy-Nagy is a way in which we already become cyborgs. We're able to see the world through a technological supplement, namely a camera. So photography is very important for him, and photography uses light. And so he also built these machinic contraptions that light itself was the medium or the form that was being played with. So this is an example from 1930, his light space modulator, which it's at MoMA. One of these is at MoMA, so I've seen it, but I've never seen it turned on. And this is probably not the best way to see it, this old black and white film, but this is the best we have. It would emanate light and it would move like a machine. This is the beginning of kinetic type sculptures that are machinic and move. And it would play with the light as a form. So rather than doing traditional painting where you're playing with color and paint and oil, on canvas, here his conception of light is the space in the room itself and the light that he's modulating with this machine that he's created. So if this doesn't fit a machine aesthetic, I'm not sure what does, right? The other thing that Bauhaus was really well known for, and still today, even probably, the stuff the really cheap stuff that people buy at IKEA or wherever else, they're almost all indebted in the modern design that would have been really cutting edge in the 1920s in Bauhaus, but also this other movement called the Stil. All of this is incredibly forward-looking at this time. So they're well known for creating, again, very streamlined furniture. There's almost nothing of the past in this. This looks like it's been made by a machine, and it's pure function, right? And it's the same thing with his bedside lamp. Think about it. The bedside lamp had to be invented and streamlined at some point, right? So you get away from like these ornate Tiffany luxury objects to this very efficient and very influential design. So many lamps look like this now, made by Marion Brandt and Hind Brednik in 1928. So Bauhaus was into design, was into architecture, but they even went into industrial production. Not all that successfully, but they did collaborate with the so-called captains of industry to design and to produce their works. So this is where Bauhaus is very clearly a type of avant-garde, where they considered their works to be a collapse of art and everyday life, where everyone should have these designed objects that are machinic and streamlined and functional. So we went through Bauhaus way too quickly. It's a really interesting movement. So if you're interested in architecture and the history of design, seek out more information on Bauhaus and watch that new, I think it's a German documentary on Bauhaus. It's very, very good. But we'll finish up with what's happening in the United States at this time, because we also have a fetishizing and a lionization of technology and of the machine. But it's even more gung-ho, which is interesting because, as we'll talk about next class, this is we're going right into the Great Depression of 1929. So like Purism, Precisionism, the name itself references a type of technology, like think of precision cutting or precision tools. Like Purism, it privileged the machine and clean, streamlined design. And Precisionists, way more than, let's say, Bauhaus. Bauhaus, they were a bit ambivalent, especially later on in the 20s, about collaborating with capitalist industry. I mean, they didn't really have a choice because the revolutionary moment of the later teens was gone. But they were ambivalent about it. Corbusier was also ambivalent about it. But in the United States, these artists are, in some ways, it's a form of propaganda for a capitalist class and for standardized form of capital accumulation through factories and through industry. And so you'll remember a few classes back, Duchamp joking that he said all the U.S. had to give was her plumbing and bridges. But many of these artists would actually probably agree, and they would say, yeah, the great aspect of our country is the modern industrial aspects of it, right? So here we have a work by Charles Demuth, My Egypt from 1927, which is one of the most famous Precisionist works. It's like a grain silo, so this industrial building, agricultural industrial building, with pipes that are emitting exhaust. It's a quasi, like you do have this fragmentation, like you have this light that comes in. It's almost slightly cubist, slightly futurist in some ways, though much more tame, like Purism. And the reference to My Egypt is Demuth basically saying, like, in the United States, these are our pyramids, like these are our monuments. And he's not saying that in like an ironic way, like he's really lionizing and glorifying industry. Again, in a way that might seem problematic for us today, not only at the level of labor and working conditions, because nothing about this looks like it's unpleasant, like it's actually like a beautiful, grain silo. But also at what we now know about emissions and climate change and global warming. So the idea of technology, of an industry within these past 100 years, think of how much it's changed in the public mind since this period. So it would be much easier for someone like Charles Demuth to unproblematically lionize and glorify technology in a way, and industry, and even emissions, in a way that's much more probably difficult for us today, with all we know about where large-scale industry and emissions have left us. The other really great precisionist would be Charles Sheeler, who is a photographer, but he's also a painter. I'm going to show you both. So at some point, he's commissioned to do photographs of the Ford Motor Company. And so there are these stunning modernist photographs. I mean, they're incredible. The way he's composed them, the way in which the factory itself recedes back into space, but then all the units of the factory, like the conveyor belts, the steam coming out of these long pipes, the water tower, all of this, it's all composed in this incredibly beautiful, pristine way. I mean, you would think that there's nothing dirty about this photograph. Like, you would think this is just a beautiful, pristine photograph. So it's in some ways like it's a photograph that's proud of the industry, right? Which would make sense. You still have a lot of people that are proud of industry. Although I think probably most Ford assembly lines and Chevrolet and whatever else, the big automobile industries that were prominent in the 20th century started moving overseas in the later 20th century. So this does seem like a very historical document here. And this type of very precise, clean photography would influence his painting, his Precisionist paintings, as you see here in his American Landscape from 1931. So again, you have the smokestack in the center, you have these fumes that are going off into the clouds, but almost like this beautiful, not threatening emission, where it's as like cloudy and billowy and soft as the clouds themselves. Then you have the snow, you have the railroad that's coming through, you have the machines, and you have this body of water. And he invites you as a viewer, like you're almost invited to go into the scene through this ladder. That's sort of pushing you up into the rest of the scene in an otherwise composition that goes the other way from right to left. So this looks like it's obviously very precise. It looks like it's been done not only based off of a photograph, but made with very precise lines, very clean lines. And it's, again, this kind of rendering and picturing of industrial progress and modernity in the United States. What's interesting is that by now, this is 1931, this is 28 and 27, 31, the Great Depression has hit. And the reality of the United States is very, very different than what comes before. So you have this gluttonous, very gilded age of the 1920s that then gives way to a 30s of utter destitution, poverty, inflation, unemployment, and so on and so forth, which unfortunately we've now entered into what might be on a similar scale with the recent pandemic of the past few months. But you would not see this in Sheeler's image. Nothing about this is referencing the Great Depression. It's looking like things are functioning very seamlessly. Industry is going well. And it certainly also doesn't show you, if it's not showing you like the grime and the dirt and the emissions of what an industrial space like this must be. I mean, look at the water. It's like pristine, beautiful water, right? That's definitely not the case around large agricultural and industrial operations. But it's also completely depopulated. It's not showing you any workers. It's not showing you any labor happening. So it's an idealizing vision of the American industrial landscape, where the reality on the ground right now in 1931 is very different. And we're actually going to pick that up in our next class when we talk about the history of photography and its role in documenting the Great Depression that crippled this country in the late 20s and 1930s. Okay, so one fell swoop. We did one class, one video for today, which is going to be a little bit longer, but I imagine shorter than two classes. But I thought it made sense to do it all in one go. So I hope you found this one interesting, and until next time.